You are standing at your workbench at 5 in the morning, and as you reach for your chisel, your fingers start to vibrate with a cold, hollow tremor that you feel all the way up to your elbow. This isn't just a bad morning. This heavy exhaustion has been stealing your strength for months, turning your body into a fragile shell. You've tried taking extra vitamins, sleeping longer, and even slowing down your work, but nothing stops the shaking. What if that trembling isn't your body failing you, but a desperate messenger trying to save your life from a shadow you haven't noticed? In the next few minutes, you will discover the terrifying truth behind a stage 4 diagnosis signed by a dead man. My name is Arthur William Vance, a 46-year-old master carpenter who spent decades turning raw oak into legacies at Vance Custom Woodworking. For years, my world was balanced by the scent of sandalwood perfume and the sight of my wife, Elena, tucking a carpenter's pencil behind her ear. When she died suddenly 4 years ago, she took the blue ribbon from our wedding day and the rhythm of my heart with her. Since then, a crushing weight has settled in my chest, a base wound born from the terrifying reality that Lily, our 10-year-old daughter, is one heartbeat away from being an orphan. Every joint I carve is a desperate attempt to build her a future I might never witness. Our household now includes Lydia Thorne, my sister-in-law, and her husband Robert, who manages my accounts while I lose myself in the sawdust. My daily routine begins at 5 in the morning with a health smoothie prepared by Lydia, followed by 12 agonizing hours where I grip my chisel until my hands vibrate with fatigue. Before we continue this journey, I want to thank you for being here today. Please comment below with your city or country so I can see where our community is watching from. Note that while this story is inspired by real family dynamics, certain names and events have been fictionalized to protect the privacy of the innocent people involved in this case. I was in the backyard on April 12th, trying to ignore the way the hammer felt like a lead weight when I decided to clean the cedar birdhouse I'd built for Lily. It's a simple structure, modeled after our home on Elm Street, but as I reached inside to clear out the old nesting, my fingers brushed against something cold and plastic. It wasn't a bird's egg. It was a small digital voice recorder taped to the inner ceiling. I pulled it out, my heart stuttering. Why would my 10-year-old daughter need to record the wind? I told myself it was just a childhood game, but the silence following that thought felt heavy and wrong. Later that evening, while Lydia was busy preparing my 7 p.m. health smoothie, I found a crumpled receipt from Miller's Pharmacy tucked inside Lily's math textbook. It wasn't for vitamins. The paper, dated March 22nd, listed a specialized sedative I'd never heard of, with the patient's name scratched out in thick black ink. The handwriting in the margin, however, was unmistakable. Lydia's sharp cursive noted the exact dosage for a nightly rest. 2 separate worlds, a hidden recorder and a sanitized drug trail, collided in my mind, creating a friction no denial could smooth over. I realized then that my house wasn't just quiet. It was being meticulously prepared for something dark and silent that I couldn't yet name. I kept the digital recorder in my pocket, its weight a cold reminder of the secrecy rotting my home. I didn't confront Lydia. Instead, I waited until the saw silenced at 6 p.m. on April 13th to slip into the shop office. My lungs felt restricted, a phantom tightness that made every breath a conscious struggle against the fatigue. I opened the steel filing cabinet where Robert keeps our project logs. My fingers, calloused from years of shaping oak, fumbled with the folders until I found the medical insurance claims from last year. Something was wrong. There were 3 claims for specialized oncology consultations I never attended, totaling $4,800, all billed to a clinic on West 4th Street. The numbers on the screen blurred as I stared at the digital ledger, my pulse hammering against my throat like a trapped bird. According to these records, I had undergone 2 chemotherapy sessions in February, yet I had spent those exact days finishing a mahogany dining table for the Miller Commission. The discrepancy wasn't a clerical error. It was a ghost trail of expenses designed to drain my savings while documenting a slow decline. My stomach churned with a cold, greasy bile as I realized my illness had a budget. I leaned against my workbench, the smell of sawdust and sweat suddenly feeling like a funeral shroud. The carefully constructed world of Vance Custom Woodworking was being dismantled from within. I watched Lydia through the kitchen window that evening, observing the way her hands moved with a practiced funereal grace as she stirred my nightly vitamin blend. The elegant, mournful tilt of her head, a pose she had perfected since Elena's death, now felt like the coil of a viper. My daughter Lily sat at the table, her eyes darting between us with a frantic, silent terror that broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. I had to maintain the mask of the dying man, forcing my body to limp toward the table while my mind raced through the implications. "Are you okay, Arthur?" from her felt like a nail being driven into my coffin by a smiling executioner. On April 15th, I bypassed my usual routine and drove to St. Jude's Hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned ivory. I needed someone who knew the truth, and that person was Sarah Miller, the head oncology nurse who had held Elena's hand during her final moments. Sarah is a woman of steel and starch, a 20-year veteran of the wards who doesn't believe in coincidences or whispers. We met in the sterile, fluorescent quiet of the third-floor cafeteria, away from the prying eyes of my caring family. Her face paled as I showed her the pharmacy receipt for the sedatives, her professional mask cracking to reveal a deep, simmering anger. Sarah reached into her nursing bag and pulled out a photocopied document, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed it onto the plastic table. "Arthur, Lily came to see me yesterday while you were in the shop," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent hum. "She showed me this report, claiming you were diagnosed with stage 4 glioblastoma 4 months ago." I stared at the paper, my name printed in bold letters next to a terminal prognosis that felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. The document looked official, stamped with the hospital's seal, but the words were a death sentence for a man who had never even had a biopsy. My mind struggled to process the sheer scale of the deception, the way the letters on the page seemed to writhe like insects. "This can't be real, Sarah," I choked out, the air in the cafeteria suddenly feeling too thin to support my weight. "I never saw a specialist. I never had these scans." Sarah leaned closer, her eyes scanning the room to ensure we weren't being overheard by the hospital staff. The conspiracy was deepening, stretching beyond a few hidden tablets and moving into the realm of professional forgery. It wasn't just Lydia's greed at play. It was a meticulous, cold-blooded plan to convince my 10-year-old daughter that her father was a walking corpse. "It gets worse, Arthur," Sarah said, pointing to the bottom of the forged report where a signature flourished in black ink. "This diagnosis is signed by Dr. Aris, the department head who treated Elena." My heart skipped a beat, a cold dread washing over me that made my skin feel like ice. "Dr. Aris was a good man," I whispered, remembering the way he had explained the pulmonary embolism to me 4 years ago. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened until it was painful, her gaze piercing through my confusion. "Arthur, Dr. Aris didn't sign this. He couldn't have. Dr. Aris died in a car accident over 2 years ago. This entire document is a ghost's lie." The revelation hit me like a falling oak, a massive, crushing weight that redefined every moment of the last 6 months. If the doctor was dead, then the entire medical foundation of my cancer was a calculated fiction, a house of cards built on the memory of my late wife. I realized then that Robert, my accountant, had to be the one who procured the letterhead and forged the documents. He was the only one with the access and the desperation. The risk wasn't just financial anymore. It was a total assault on my sanity and my daughter's future. My family had turned the hospital where Elena died into a weapon to bury me alive beside her. I left the hospital with a fire in my veins that the fatigue couldn't touch, my mind already mapping out the structure of a trap. The conspiracy was a rotten beam in the center of my home, and I was the only one who could cut it out without the whole ceiling collapsing on Lily. But I needed to know how deep the poison went before I made my move. Before we dive into the dark secrets I found in Robert's offshore accounts, I need your input on something critical. Do you think I should confront Robert first to get a confession, or wait until I have proof against Lydia too? Type Robert or wait in the comments below. I sat in the dim light of the workshop, the smell of turpentine stinging my nostrils as I stared at the bank statements Robert had tried to bury. My hands felt like heavy stones, the thallium still pulsing through my veins, but my eyes were sharp as a chisel. On May 14th, 3 wire transfers of exactly $15,000 each had moved from Vance Custom Woodworking to a shell corporation called Thorn Lydia Holdings in the Cayman Islands. These weren't just accounting errors, they were the structural blueprints of my own ruin. Every dollar I had earned carving oak and pine was being siphoned into a reservoir of greed while I was fed poison. My investigation took a darker turn when I found a series of encrypted emails on the office desktop, dated June 2nd, between Lydia and a local notary named Marcus Sterling. Marcus was a man I had trusted for 20 years to handle my property deeds and business contracts. The messages were clinical and cold, discussing the finalization of the asset transfer upon my imminent medical incapacitation. My breath hitched in my chest as I realized the rot had spread beyond my home into the very institutions that were supposed to protect my legacy. It wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a coordinated siege involving legal experts who were already dividing my skin. On June 4th, at exactly 2:15 p.m., Sarah Miller slipped a gray folder into my hands behind the hospital cafeteria. The lab results from the secret toxicology screen were a physical blow to my heart. My blood didn't contain cancer cells. It was saturated with thallium at levels 4 times the lethal limit. The report stated that the ingestion was prolonged and consistent, matching the timeline of the morning smoothies Lydia prepared with such funereal grace. Seeing the chemical name on the paper made the betrayal feel like a serrated blade. I wasn't dying of a disease. I was being methodically erased by the woman who pretended to mourn my sister's death. That evening, the air in the kitchen felt thick with unsaid things, a static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. Lydia watched me from the stove, her eyes narrowing as I hesitated before taking a sip of the vitamin blend. The way she tilted her head, a practiced, mournful angle, now felt like the predatory coil of a viper. "You're not drinking, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a soft, velvet threat that echoed against the tile walls. I had to force the toxic liquid down my throat, feeling it burn like liquid fire, just to keep the mask of the dying man from slipping before I was ready to strike back. The risk escalated on June 6th, when Robert brought a stack of legal documents to my bedside, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where Lydia stood like a sentinel. They wanted me to sign a revised will and a power of attorney that would effectively hand them the keys to my shop and my daughter's future. The pressure was no longer subtle. It was a physical weight pressing against my lungs as they insisted I secure Lily's safety before the imaginary stage 4 cancer took my mind. I held the pen, my fingers vibrating with a mixture of thallium-induced weakness and a father's cold, calculated fury at their absolute lack of shame. I crept to the hallway later that night, my socks muffling my steps on the hardwood floor I had polished 1,000 times. Through the crack in Lily's door, I heard Lydia's voice, honey thick and poisonous. She was telling my 10-year-old daughter that my condition was worsening because I was fighting the inevitable, and that Lily needed to be brave enough to let me go. My heart shattered into jagged shards as I realized she was weaponizing my daughter's love, turning her into a silent accomplice in my own murder. The psychological trauma they were inflicting on that child was a crime far worse than the theft of every cent I had ever earned. Determination burned through my fatigue like a forest fire as I waited for them to leave for funeral planning on June 8th. I tore through Lydia's vanity, my hands shaking as I searched for the physical link to the toxicology report. Hidden inside an antique velvet jewelry box, one that had belonged to my late wife, Elena, I found a small amber vial labeled thallium sulfate. It sat there among Elena's pearls like a venomous spider, a clinical instrument of death used to mimic the symptoms of a terminal brain tumor. This was the irrefutable proof I needed to destroy their charade. A tiny bottle of liquid malice that held the power to end my family's long, dark nightmare. As I gripped the vial, a horrifying thought took root in my mind, cold and sharp as a winter frost. Elena had died of a sudden pulmonary embolism 4 years ago, an event that had shattered my world and brought Lydia into our home as a savior. I looked at the handwriting on the thallium bottle and compared it to the notes Lydia had written in Lily's math book. The cursive was identical, a sharp, aggressive script that signaled a long-standing pattern of calculated cruelty. The possibility that my wife's death wasn't an accident, but the first act in a 4-year-long play for my heritage, made the room spin with a dizzying, nauseating sense of total betrayal. I had the proof, the names, and the poison, but as I turned to leave the room, the door creaked open to reveal Lydia standing there, her face a mask of cold, ivory fury. The mourning sister was gone, replaced by a predator who realized her prey was no longer sleeping. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as she stepped inside, blocking my only exit while clutching a heavy brass candlestick. Before I reveal the terrifying choice she forced me to make in that locked room, I must warn you. What comes next is deeply disturbing. This is your last chance to turn away if you cannot handle the raw truth of family betrayal. My heart didn't break. It felt like a heavy mallet struck my ribs, splintering bone into my lungs. As I stood in that dim room, clutching the thallium vial, I saw a notebook beneath Lydia's jewelry box, Lily's diary, but filled with Lydia's aggressive, slanted handwriting. My vision blurred as I read the words that had turned my daughter into a ghost. Lydia hadn't just told her I was dying. She had whispered that I was the reason my wife, Elena, was dead. She told my child that my cancer was a divine curse for my negligence during the accident. The truth was a clinical, cold-blooded desecration of everything I had ever built for my family. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls of the Vance home closing in to crush the remaining air from my chest. Lydia had turned my little girl into my jailer, wrapping her in a shroud of guilt no 10-year-old should ever carry. My hands, still vibrating from the thallium, gripped the vanity until my fingernails bled. The fatigue that had haunted me for months was suddenly replaced by a cold, crystalline adrenaline. Every lie Lydia told about Elena's death was a spark that ignited a furnace of protective rage. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the survival of my daughter's sanity in a house of serpents. Everything from the last 6 months replayed in my mind like a warped film strip. I remembered the night Lily cried over a burnt roast, her small shoulders shaking with a grief I couldn't understand. I thought she was just tired, but she believed it was my last supper. I recalled her frantic refusal to let me lift that heavy oak crate last month, her eyes wide with a terror that I now realized was her trying to keep my crumbling spine from snapping. My love for Elena, once a source of strength, was now a jagged blade Lydia used to bleed our daughter dry in the silence of our own home. I didn't just want justice. I wanted to dismantle the house of cards Lydia and Robert had built with the same precision I used on a masterwork table. The fear of leaving Lily an orphan was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty that I was the only one who could save her from their poison. I tucked the vial and diary into my coat, my steps silent and predatory on the hardwood floors. The time for being a victim was over. The master carpenter was about to cut out the rot once and for all. Before I face the woman who destroyed my life, are you still with me? Type yes in the comments now. On June 10th at 8 p.m., The air in our living room was heavy with the scent of lilies and the clinical rot of betrayal. I sat in my oak armchair, the one I'd carved with Elena's initials, looking like the dying man while Robert and Lydia hovered like vultures over a fresh kill. Detective Sam Vane stood by the window, disguised as a legal notary, holding a folder that contained the death warrant of their greed. Lydia placed the revised power of attorney documents on my lap, her hand trembling with a hunger she couldn't hide. "Sign it, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a hollow chime. "Do it for Lily's future before your mind finally fades away." Instead of signing, I looked Lydia directly in her cold, ivory eyes and dropped the amber thallium vial onto the mahogany table. The sound of glass hitting wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. At that moment, the front door opened, and Sarah Miller walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers from the 14th Precinct. Robert's face turned the color of damp ash as I slid the secret toxicology report and the forged medical files across the surface. "This isn't a will, Lydia," I said, my voice vibrating with a strength that paralyzed them both. "It is the clinical blueprint of your murder plot, documented in 4 times the lethal limit of thallium sulfate." Lydia's elegant mask didn't just crack. It shattered into jagged shards of desperate manipulation. She lunged toward the table, her hands clawing at the documents while she shrieked that the cancer was making me delusional. She turned to the officers, her voice a frantic, high-pitched warble of a grieving sister-in-law, claiming I was experiencing a psychotic break brought on by terminal glioblastoma. "He's confused, officers. He's dying and doesn't know what he's saying," she sobbed, clutching her chest as if she were the one being assaulted. It was a practiced funereal performance she had polished for months, but the cold, hard facts of the thallium report were a wall she couldn't climb over or around. When Detective Vane revealed the hidden recording device I'd found in the birdhouse, Lydia's facade finally exploded into a furnace of venom. She stopped sobbing and stood tall, her face twisting into a mask of pathological hatred that made the officers reach for their holsters. Elena was always the golden child, the one who got the master carpenter and the beautiful life while I was left with the scraps. She spat, her voice dripping with resentment. She admitted to the vitamin blends, screaming that I deserved to rot for being as weak as my wife was. Her confession was a flood of toxic truth, confirming she had been methodically erasing me for months. Robert crumbled before the first handcuff even clicked, blubbering a full confession about the offshore accounts and the forged signatures in exchange for a plea deal. Detective Vane read them their Miranda rights against the very walls I had built to protect my family from the outside world. As they were let out in steel restraints, the neighbors on Elm Street gathered on their porches, watching in stunned silence as the saintly Lydia Thorne was exposed as a predator. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the windows of Vance Custom Woodworking, signaling the end of the 6-month siege on my life. The air in the house suddenly felt clean, the clinical rot finally purged by the truth. Justice was precise as a dovetail joint. 3 months later, Lydia was sentenced to 25 years without parole for attempted murder and child endangerment. Robert received 10 years for his role in the financial fraud, with every cent of the $400,000 in offshore accounts being returned to the business. Marcus Sterling, the notary, had his legal license permanently revoked and faces 5 years for racketeering. As I stood in the courtroom, watching them being taken to the state penitentiary, I felt the phantom weight in my chest finally lift. The house of cards had fallen, and in its place stood the solid foundation of a father who survived for his child. 6 months have passed since the sirens faded on Elm Street, and the scent of fresh sawdust has finally replaced the clinical stench of betrayal. I am currently finishing a cradle made of solid cherry, my hands steady, and the thallium tremors now a fading ghost of the past. Lily sits nearby, her laughter no longer sounding like a brittle glass shard, but like the music Elena used to hum while painting. We visited Elena's grave yesterday, placing a blue ribbon on the stone, and for the first time, I didn't feel the crushing weight of an impending funeral. The rot is gone, our foundation is restored, and though the scars remain, this home is finally built on solid oak. I look at you now, because you must understand that wood never lies. If there is a knot in the grain or rot in the sap, the structure will eventually collapse under its own deception. You must trust your instincts when the people closest to you offer medicine wrapped in a predatory smile, for as the scripture says, whatever is hidden will be brought into the light. My house is quiet, the termites are purged, and Lily is finally a child again instead of my guardian. Please comment truth below, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. This story was a dramatization for educational purposes. Please consult professionals for legal or medical advice regarding your own specific family situations.